Good evening and welcome to the Kennedy School Forum for yet another lively evening of conversation. This has always been, and to our guests, we're delighted that you're here. This has always been one of the most prestigious forums at the university, despite the feelings of the business school about what they have across the river. But we will take that in good stride and good camaraderie. Let me say you a bit about the context in which we find ourselves this evening. Over the last, I would say, couple of years, there's been an enormous effort cutting across 6 schools, but led in particular by one individual, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, to initiate a new program here at the university called the Advanced Leadership Initiative. And as Rosabeth Nitinoria and Rakesh Khurana, all on the business school faculty, wrote a paper a couple of years ago arguing that, in effect, universities should now embrace a third stage of education. Originally, universities were intended to help people and work with people at the beginning of their careers. And over time, universities embraced the idea of working with people in mid-careers. And it was given the changing nature of demographics and people's life interests and how much vitality that the new 60 is the old 50 or maybe even 40, that it was very important to begin a program for people who had completed a career, who then wanted to have, in effect, a second life, and not on a virtual second life, but to have a real second life in which they could possibly repot themselves and come back and work for the public good. Whatever they've been doing before, many of whom they'd worked already for the public good, but whatever they've been doing before, they could now open this new chapter in their lives. And so the university approved and launched this Advanced Leadership Initiative, and we now have 14, the first class of 14 fellows who are here, and it's a wonderful group, several of whom are here maybe here in the audience tonight. Those of you who are fellows, could you stand just for a minute? Let's just to see who's here. Are there some here? Yes, sir. Wonderful. And the notion is that they are spending a good chunk of a year here, and one of the special features of this program is that periodically there are think tanks in special areas. This weekend is the think tank for education and education reform. And that brought to the university a number of distinguished visitors, and we thought, what a wonderful moment to showcase this and to have a conversation about educational reform. And so to cut directly to the chase, that's what we're now going to do this evening. Rosabeth Moss-Cantor is going to be our moderator, and she is a wonderfully distinguished professor at the business school, the Ernest Arbuckle Professor, where she has specialized in strategy, innovation, and leadership for change. She is the author or co-author of 17 books, and as many of you know here, she has been a wonderful friend of this school, the Kennedy School, our Center for Public Leadership, but so many other different forums here. She is an extraordinarily good citizen, both of the country and of the world. To her left is Ron Ferguson, who's here on this faculty, has been on this faculty since 1983. He's at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. His teaching and publications cover a variety of issues related to education and economic development. To his left is Charita Kurvant, who's president of Creative Associates International. She's the founder, president, and CEO. It's a professional and technical services firm that specializes in communities in transition, education, and training. To her left is Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director for Education for OECD. Many of you know the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an incredibly important organization that has done a great deal to advance the economies of Europe and the Atlantic. In 2003, he won a prize for exemplary, it's named after the first German president of the German Federal Republic, and it was the prize for exemplary democratic engagement in association with the public debate on a program for international student assessments. This has been a very, this issue is quite touchy in this country. Well, it's touchy in many countries about how assessments should be done. Then, let's see. Okay. I want to, for those of you who have not had the privilege of meeting the president of Brown University, this is an opportunity for you. Ruth Simmons has just come from speaking to our Zuckerman Fellows for an hour and a half. She is a woman of extraordinary accomplishment who began her life as the 12th child of sharecroppers in Texas. And she worked her way up from there to a PhD in Romance languages from Harvard University. She has been the president of Smith College, and Smith went into mourning when Brown University came and sought her out and brought her to Providence back in 2001. And I was telling students earlier today that when Hillary Clinton came to the campus some months ago, and Ruth Simmons was there to introduce her. When Ruth Simmons got up to speak, she got a standing ovation for 10 minutes from the assembled. That was even before she said anything about Hillary Clinton. So I think it says something about the high regard in which she is held. And Leah Ibarra, who's to her left, Leah is from the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins. The center, through its many academic programs, enrolls over 90,000 students annually from throughout the United States and 70 countries. It also provides distance education courses to students in the United States and over 30 countries. So what we have in store tonight is a conversation about change and reform and leadership in education, which is broad gauge. It's not just about the United States, indeed, but about the challenges that we face across the world and providing improved, innovative education for students of many, many countries. And there's no one better to moderate this than Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, my good friend. Rosabeth, over to you.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. I mean, education is clearly back on the policy agenda in this country in a very significant way as one of the 3 priorities, as a major part of infrastructure and a stimulus, because the human infrastructure is what makes a country great. And it's back on the agenda not only because education is the route to jobs, but also because it's the route to citizenship in a democracy. And we are thinking about how we reinvent what democracies mean around the world. So this is very timely to be talking about education and leadership for education. You know, in my lifetime, we've been through many symbolic wars, if not actual wars, the war on poverty, then there was the war on terror. Now I'm wondering whether we should be waging a war on ignorance, and that should be part of how we think about this agenda, that it's not just a nice-to-have education, it's essential. But we're going to be comparing the US and the rest of the world. We have a very talented group here that knows education from many aspects. But I want to start asking about what I think is a dilemma, and I want to ask you, President Simmons, Ruth, I want to start with you because here's an American dilemma. First of all, you lead one of the finest institutions of higher education in the world. We often here at Harvard actually say, Brown, we need to model more things that we do here after Brown. An excellent institution. And we have in the United States probably still the finest system of higher education in the entire world. Why are we so behind in K through 12 education? Why is there a gap between higher education and basic education? And does higher education have a responsibility to do something about that?
to care about what's happening in K through 12, but also to do something about it. But there is a prevailing sense, in my judgment, in higher education, that we don't value education enough. And so our students come to us and they say they want to be teachers, and we say, but you could do so much more. Well, they can't do so much more. There's nothing more valuable to us than for the best and the brightest students to really teach. And we've moved away in this country from a sense that this venerable profession really deserves the best and the brightest of us. I really have felt for a long time that until we return to the point where we validate that, that we will lose some of the best teachers available to our students. Secondly, I think, in higher education, we have an extraordinary process where it's clear that we value professors. We put them through torture, we put them through tenure, we say only the best can remain. And there is a sense in which in teaching in K through 12, we don't have the same kind of process in place. How well we learn is very dependent on the quality of people we are interacting with. And that certainly has been the mark of this institution. It's the mark of Brown. It has to be the mark of educational institutions everywhere. I was very fortunate to be inspired by people like that as a child. Without them, without those teachers, I would never have dreamed of being able to go to college at all. So we have to focus on the profession. We have to focus on preparing the teachers. We have to provide a way for the best and brightest to come into the profession. What Brown did recently is to institute a program of free tuition for students who will take a master's degree from Brown and teach in the Providence schools. I think every institution of higher education, especially Harvard, should provide free tuition for the best and the brightest to come to study, to become more capable in teaching, and to go back into our schools. And we've just got to have a national movement to do that.
So higher education has a responsibility, and congratulations to Brown for acting on that responsibility. Do you see, does it make a difference in the students you have coming to Brown that we have fallen behind, and I'm going to see what the international comparisons are in a moment, but that the U.S. has fallen behind in K through 12 achievement?
It does, but I have to say, I was in one of those systems, let's say, during segregation that everybody consigned to be a very weak system. And the presumption was that, in fact, because of that inferior system, I would have a very hard time advancing in education. But there is something so beautiful about the fact that the human mind can recover from all kinds of things. We will always have an uneven system in the country, but what we must have is we must have access for students. We must hold out the promise that they will be able to advance within the system. And I had a student a couple of years ago who came to me who was disconsolate because he wanted to study engineering. But he came from an inner city high school where they didn't even teach calculus. And he didn't know how he was going to be able to do that. And then we had faculty members. We have a very good math department. We had faculty members who decided to take time to bring him up to speed. Often in college you have people who are too advanced for those students who are not good enough. But we have to be good enough to be there for those students who are not quite good enough. And I think that provided we're able to do that, there's some tolerance for students as they mature to be not all AP students, right? But students who are coming from the inner city who have less good preparations. Colleges should be a place where students can come in, be provided with opportunities to gain the knowledge that they don't have. This is a very unpopular view among my peers, I think, but I still believe that it's the case, and that we miss out on some great opportunities if we don't look for those students who have the potential and the talent, and then provide opportunities for them to be educated.
Well, that is a heartening vision, by the way, to think that with all the evidence that preschool forms the brain and then that's it, that in fact you can still take a student from a less advantaged high school and make them a proud graduate of Brown University. Can we do that, Ron Ferguson? Ron, you have written about the achievement gap, the racial achievement gap, and also how to close it. So these kinds of gaps, good schools, poor schools, how much of this is race-based? What do we do about that? Is that an that's another American dilemma that we've had for a long time. Are we getting better?
Well, let's make a few distinctions. One, there are huge racial gaps in achievement that we should be really concerned about. By the time students get to 12th grade, there are about 4 years difference between blacks and Hispanics on the one hand versus whites and Asians on the other hand. So these are big racial differences. But at the same time, the best evidence we have suggests that around the first birthday, there are not racial differences. The Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey birth cohort finds, using a thing called the Bailey test, that around the time of the first birthday, we're all in the same bell-shaped curve. It is a bell-shaped curve even at age 1, but you can't predict where somebody is going to fall based upon something about their race or ethnicity. By 3 years old, the curves have started to separate, and you can detect the racial gaps. And the evidence is accumulating that it's got a lot to do with early childhood experience. And we're also doing the research that's starting to tell us what the parenting practices and the early experiences are that kids need to have. Now, fortunately, brain research is also telling us that the brain changes across the life cycle. And whenever you have an experience from which you can learn, there are physical changes in the brain. And so it's never too late. And we have to start to help both parents and children understand that, so that some kids don't think they're just stuck stupid and other people think they're stuck smart. Carol Dweck has done work to show that kids' orientations toward learning are affected by their beliefs about the nature of the brain. If they think that they're kind of stuck where they are because of their birth and their genetics, they tend to have performance goals. The kids who think they're not smart want to play it off and act like they're not trying and like they don't care, so that people won't decide that their low performance is because of their low aptitude. And the kids who think they're smart just want to show off because they want to let everybody know that they're smarter. And it's about 3rd grade that the kids start to detect these differences and act on their differences and beliefs about intelligence. But to make a long story short, I think there's huge potential to close these gaps. We actually, between 1971 and 1988, 62% of the black-white reading score gap in the National Assessment of Educational Progress disappeared. So it's 17 years, 62% of a gap that people were saying was genetic in 1970 was gone. Okay, we don't morph that fast. So something changed in what kids learned. And in fact, even IQ, the IQ of the entire United States population rose by 18 points in the latter 2/3 of the last century. We often talk about IQ as if it's the real genetic measure of intelligence. Well, genetics don't change that fast. So our life experiences in the United States changed during the 20th century in a way that rose all of us. And even as that was happening, between 1972 and 2002, the black-white IQ gap closed by about 1/4. All right? So IQ measures certain types of skills. Achievement tests measure other types of skills. We've made progress on all of those. Even after that progress, the gaps are still huge. I argue, I think the word movement, you used it. I think we need a national social movement for social and political, cultural movement for excellence with equity. Okay, we've got to raise everybody, and we've got to close the gaps while we do it.
Terrific. First of all, I think many of the people in the Advanced Leadership Fellowship here are going to be very heartened to hear that the brain can keep changing at any age and you can keep learning. That's a very hopeful sign too, and it's hopeful to know that we don't have to wait for human evolution, and it's not genetic, that intervention, the attention that President Simmons was talking about really matters. But are we falling behind the rest of the world? Andreas Schleicher, You look at the indicators. You've done the testing. You've made the comparisons between countries. Who's ahead? Who's behind? And, well, we know the U.S. isn't doing as well as it once was. Why?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that the United States still has the most highly educated adult labor force. And I'm saying this because it's a huge capital to build on. There's no other country in the industrialized world that has such a high level of education in the adult labor force. And that's because the United States was the first country that made education universal, school education and college to some extent. And again, sort of the parents of the children today have a capital that few other countries do have. And while you're quite right, today sort of things look different in the school system. I would still think the United States has lots of great schools. Some of the states have high performance standards. On the other hand, of what you see is that the United States has an exceptionally high rate of failure in the education system. If you look, 25% of the 15-year-olds today on our latest PISA assessment don't make it to the minimum level of competency that enables you to continue learning. And that's, I think, a very, very important indicator. And it's that end of the spectrum that drags performance in the United States down to rank 20, 25, depending on what subject you take, among the 30 principal industrialized countries. So that's a rather sort of a depressing picture of today. But on the other hand, those very comparisons that look problematic, that indicate problems, also point to many of the solutions. I mean, you do see countries that were well behind. You take a country like Korea, in the 1960s had the level of economic development of Afghanistan today, one of the least developed education systems, and made it right to the top. You take Singapore, another inspirational story of success. You take Poland in the last 10 years, moving the average performance of 15-year-old children by 3/4 of a school year, of every child. So performance gains in the United States have been rather modest. It's not that things have got worse. I don't think we have any evidence pointing to that. But it's clear that many countries have risen much faster. They have succeeded to direct. And I think one point is also important. The impact that social background has on learning outcomes in the United States is particularly strong, much stronger than in other countries. And there are two things you need to keep separate here. One is social diversity in society. You can't change that. But what our indicators suggest you can moderate is the impact that diversity has on learning outcomes. And you do have a number of countries that are diverse, but it doesn't make such a difference in terms of learning outcomes. You take Canada across the northern border, that does quite well on this in North America. You take most of the Asian societies that are really very strong in moderating socioeconomic diversity. You get Northern Europe, Finland, the top performing education in the world. What's so striking about Finland? It's not this high average performance, but it's the fact that only 4% of the performance variability in the student population lies between schools. Every school succeeds. That's where success becomes systemic.
So given that we still have some remaining, shall we say, ends of the bell-shaped curve in America, how much of that is not socioeconomic? You said you think it's not class. Is it the racial disparity? Is it because we don't invest in schools in those areas that have populations?
Can I point out one thing?
Yeah?
I think it's
Go for it.
important to make it clear that even our white students are not at the top of the pack in the international comparisons. Okay, in the latest data that I've looked at, more than a dozen countries are doing better than the United States white students. So the diversity gives us some of that. But we need to be clear that we're talking about a national phenomenon. So it's excellence for everybody. It's not just the achievement gap.
So it's a schools issue, it's not a populations issue in your mind. But we have an expert here. We have Leah Ibarra, who's an expert on gifted children, among other things. So where do we find the gifted children? Are they concentrated in certain communities among certain populations? Those who get labeled gifted, because we're hearing that labeling and expectation effects make a big difference. And are we doing well by our gifted children? Are we shortchanging our gifted children? Should we be emphasizing gifted children at all when we have so many at the bottom that we need to raise up?
Well, first let me start off by saying that it's a population issue when people stereotype. At the Center for Talented Youth, and I'll update some of the figures, we actually have students coming in from over 100 countries in every state in the U.S. When we have students that, when we have always been very good at international diversity, but domestic diversity was not what we were so good at the very beginning, and that's the way it is across the U.S. in gifted education. When I first said we have to reflect the face of America, we must bring in gifted children, and they're in every neighborhood in this country. They're just not identified. The first thing I was told by some of the staff was, well, does that mean we're going to decrease standards? I said, that's an insult to those communities to say we're going to decrease standards. There are bright children, as I mentioned, everywhere. And so what we said is, I'm not going to decrease standards. I'm going to increase outreach. There has not been a school in this country that we've gone to, as poor and as destitute as that school is, where you have not found bright children. But the stereotypes persist, not just among the society in general, but I've been in schools where we go in and the teachers will tell me, or the principals, you know what, you're wasting your time here. No, none of these students are going to qualify for your Hopkins program. They're just not. So what I ask myself, and I think what we should all ask ourselves, if those teachers and those administrators feel that those children are not there and don't even bother to have them test for us, what does that mean? And how do you think they're teaching them? So I think that's the critical issue that we have to look at. Is as simple as it is to say there are bright children in every neighborhood, there are bright children in every group, whether it's white, Asian, white, black, Native American. As simple and as common as that should be for us to believe and to understand, it's just not still happening in too many areas. And so I think that's been the biggest challenge, is to get away from those kinds of stereotypes. The other thing is, for our students that come into our program, they take the SAT at 7th and 8th grade that most of you know took the, take as juniors and seniors. Our students score at that level sometimes perfect 800s, even at the age of 9 or 10. So we have so many bright students in this country from every single group. But what are we told? Well, you know what? They're fine. I think what has happened, this is the second part, I think, of not reaching these students, is that oftentimes, and it's true for every child in this country that's gifted, but it's even more true for minority students. When people look at risk as only those students that are at risk for not reading or for dropping out of school, they don't look at what we consider at risk. Those students that are bright, but if they had just a little bit of help, if they just had a classroom or a class or a course that they could take, how much brighter and how much more could they achieve in their lives? I think that's where it makes a difference. And oftentimes we don't offer that to the students. We assume if they're bright, they're going to make it anyway. Well, when you look at statistics, when you look at even Latino and African American students with the same SAT scores and the same GPAs as their colleagues in high school that are white and Asian, they don't go to the top university at the same level. So what we've been able to do, and it's not theoretical anymore because we've been doing it for about 10 years now, is we've taken children from very poor neighborhoods and white children from Appalachia as much as black children from inner city Newark and Baltimore, and Latinos and Native Americans from Indian reservations in Arizona. And we have shown that even though they had gaps in their education because they were in poor schools, taking classes with us, because we believe that you raise the bar for everybody. You don't just bring the bottom up and keep the top there because they start coming down. We have to make everybody achieve, and we have to help everyone achieve. So by giving them courses in middle school in genetics and neuroscience and robotics and so forth, they are able to do just as well as every other child, because the difference is we're not expecting for them not to do as well. We know they're going to do as well. So yes, I think it has been answered that in essence, minority children, poor children must be treated as being exceptional children just like everybody else and given those opportunities.
So we'll come back to the question later, which I'm sure may be on people's minds, about when there are limited resources, where those resources get directed. But there's a consistent theme so far, which is under the right conditions, there are children who can achieve at high levels everywhere, but what are those right conditions? And I want to turn to you, Charita Cruvant, because you can add a community dimension to the discussion. What are those conditions under which children thrive?
Well, I happen to have maybe the bad news or the difficult opportunity to. We work mainly in areas of conflict, and we work in extreme poverty, so that when I listen to my colleagues here, it's kind of luxury conversation that I'm having, and so it's just and I don't want to kind of put a little bit of cold water into it. But the rest of the world, it's living in such an extreme poverty, and I'm sure it's going to become more and more so in the next few years. And we are also working in areas where there's major conflict, wars. And right now in the world, sadly enough, there are more than 35 civil wars or wars, and so in which children are not only living, but hopefully they are having some kind of education. So your question to me makes me do two things. One, do I answer very lightly? Or the other one is to say, what are the conditions? And to say as well, the conditions are that wherever you are, those children deserve to go from wherever they are to the next step. I mean, and that's the simplicity in my answer as a practitioner, is to say, as you know, there are the ills of the past that we worldwide, globally, we will not be able to resolve it all at once, but at least with enough data and with enough tools, and that's where teacher training comes as a critical component. With enough tools, I think all of us worldwide, globally, can easily plan and make a commitment to improve the lives of children in the next 10 years, and to literally be able to figure out how we have the tools, if we have the commitment, if we have the unity of purpose, we do have the opportunity to all together to figure out how to improve. The conditions worldwide are horrible. However, the experiences, we usually are creative, we usually say is we do ordinary things in extraordinary situations. We work in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Sudan. We work with the gangs in Guatemala. Most of those children tend to be quite frequently illiterate. And not by choice. Many of them, they have been child soldiers for years and years. Now, when we're given the opportunity to work, we find that the discipline of fear, because they were fighting, and though if they're given the opportunity to learn, in about 3 months, most of them, they can become literate. They can decode. They have had wonderful memories. They have abilities to do things. So that it all depends, and that's where my enthusiasm about being involved in education comes, is yes, the past might not have been so wonderful. And the future does not really require the same kind of skills, because some of them might want to be in the computer world and another ones just really want to make it for the day. And what we need to figure out is that education has a role and has a responsibility to help all those children to be from where they are to the next level. And so that sometimes I think, maybe because I'm a practitioner with a very small budget, I worry that sometimes we have these goals, like universal education for the world, and maybe it's an aspiration, maybe it's a dream. Let's just figure out basic things on which we can all collaborate and go from one step to another. We work in Afghanistan, and as he was mentioning, most of you do know that young girls have been left out of the system for years. We, however, found that most of them, in 1 year, they can cover 3 years of schooling. Motivation is one critical component. That confidence. Now people care about me. I can do it. It gives these young women the sense of yes, I can do it. So in 1 year, most of them, and they not only just pass the test, they get better grades than in the United States. So there's something about us that sometimes we get into this kind of easy life, and we think that just it's our right. No, we really, honestly, we have such a great opportunity. So we worked years ago in South Africa, where most of the young boys were totally, these are African, black South Africans, where most boys were really forbidden from taking math. The moment they got good enough about reading and writing, the math was what the system took that away from them. So we used to kind of underground things so that the kids would learn to really do math. We found that once apartheid became a reality and children could go to school, in 2 years, most of these young boys could really do 4 years of math in one. Motivation, commitment, unity of force, and also the world saying, yes, you can do it.
So it is so clear that we see the limitations not in people, that the human mind is capable of learning. It's something in institutions. And so if we have limited resources, I wish we had unlimited resources, where should we put them to start making change? Where would you put the biggest part of the education budget?
Looking at me?
Yeah, you first. You're at the Kennedy School, so you think about policy and budget and resource allocation.
Well, I'm on either parenting or leadership. And we just finished a report on whole school district improvement based on a conference where we had teams come in from school districts that have made progress. And what was remarkable is that in every case when people talked about their progress, there was somebody in their district who was a voice in their head. There was the magic he or the magic she that they kept referring back to. He noticed this, and then he said that. And it was that they had so much confidence in this leader, and they knew this person had a certain force, that if he was thinking this way, we knew we were going that way. And so trying to train people in leadership positions to know what to ask of people, to have the courage to hold people seriously accountable, to have enough expertise themselves to be able to make judgments about when people are doing good work or not. That's a major challenge in American public education. You go into districts, sometimes you see it, and you know it when you see it. Other places, you just see it's not there. And we've got to work on that. At the same time, I mentioned that gap opens up in the first 3 years. And we're being able to understand now that it's got to do with how people talk to their toddlers, how much they talk to them, the ratio of positive reinforcements to harsh discipline. There are a number of things that we can teach young parents that will make a big difference if we can reach them. And so trying to develop the mechanisms to reach young parents would be one place that I'd put some resources. The other place would try to take people who are both sort of relentlessly driven to make a difference and driven to understand the details of what good teaching looks like and what good schools look like, so they can combine that determination with the insight and the wisdom to really get the work done. And when we can stick people like that in leadership positions, they're often able to bring folks along quite a distance.
So I'm hearing that there are some things that have to do with the school, but you talked about leadership in the community, you talked about parents. None of that really has to do with the building. And often in discussions about education, we're thinking about the building. How important are the things outside of the building? I mean, Ruth Simmons, you think a lot about whole student life because you have a campus that's residential. How important are the factors that are not directly in the classroom, but impact motivation, impact a climate for learning?
I think everything is important when it comes to the whole child. It's important that everybody validate that what they're doing is important. And in that regard, I think actually that we need a cultural change in this country. We all go to different countries and see young people with their families prizing the fact that their children are able to go to a classroom that's a shipping container. And they think it's wonderful because here's an opportunity for them to learn. So culturally speaking, throughout that country, there's a value placed on education. And that means that families sacrifice in order to make it happen. And when you see your family sacrificing, you want to do something because your family is sacrificing for it. I think we've evolved to the point in this country where so many of us are really not willing to give up anything for this precious, precious thing called education. In certain communities, you'll hear individuals say, well, I certainly don't want my taxes raised to help pay for improved schools because I don't have kids. It takes all of the community understanding that our future is tied to making these opportunities available for everybody, until we're willing to give up something to make it happen, we're back to the same question, and that is we don't value it enough. So our universities have to value it. They can't say, well, if you're a high school teacher, that's not as good as being a university professor. It comes through everything we do and all the statements we make and all the actions we take that suggest that education really isn't all that valuable. So I think it's after-school programs, it's preschool activities, it's parents being involved in the schools, it's everything. When I was a child, I don't want to get too personal, but it was very important to me that the teachers that I had were not 9-to-5 teachers. They were people that I understood were a part of my life, and I wanted to please them. I had no idea what I was doing by studying. I wasn't, I wanted to make A's, and I wanted to achieve because I admired them so much, because they were making a commitment to me and they cared about me. I think that degree of caring is really what makes it possible for children to think that this is an important thing that they do, and we should be doing that whenever we can.
So a greater sense of community involvement would make a big difference. But I want to pick up on one thing you said earlier that had to do with not being willing to vote for the bond issue, to pay for the schools because they're not my children in the schools. One of the things I want to praise the Advanced Leadership Fellows for is that there's such an interest in doing something about the educational system, even though many of the Advanced Leadership Fellows already have their children grown and out of schools. And this is the opposite of that generational politics we were about to have, where the people in the exclusive suburban gated communities would not pay for school bond issues because not my children. So that sense that they're all our children and that we have some collective and shared responsibility. So Andrea Schleicher, does that go on in other countries that are doing better than the U.S. is in achievement? And do they have a different kind of system and pay for schools differently than we do?
Well, first of all, I think one has to be clear that there are very few countries that spend as much on education as the United States on a per pupil basis. A couple of them, but
So does that say money doesn't have a lot to do with results?
I think there's several issues. It's the volume of resources is one thing. I think some of the countries doing well get the money to where the challenges are greatest. They get the most talented teachers into the best schools, into the most difficult schools. I think it's to do with allocation. It's to do with spending choices that are being made. The United States has favored smaller classes over better salaries and working conditions. That's a choice you make, but you pay a price for that. And I think what's important, you can double teacher salaries, but if you don't change the incentive structures and the work environment in which they work, nothing will change. And if you look at the best performing systems in the world, take Finland or Korea or Singapore. They get 9 applications for 1 teaching post. Do they pay these people so extremely well? Yeah, Korea does, Finland does not. What these countries do, they provide incentives for people to collaborate. They give teachers not necessarily a high level of initial education, but they give them on-the-job, everyday training. They give leadership in the schools. They connect the teachers. Teachers work embedded in a profession. They develop their knowledge. They are the education system. It's not this industrial mindset where you have someone who invents some standards and then trains everybody how to implement it in the classroom. But it's a knowledge kind of work where people themselves, the teachers, the people who work with the school leaders work together and implement this. And that creates the incentives for people to do good work, to get the best people in the profession. This idea of money, I hear this all the time, but if it's just the volume of money, you're number one.
Well, you'll be, yeah, right, okay. Number one in something. You probably may know that the most popular recruiter now on college campuses, on distinguished college campuses, is Teach for America.
Yeah.
So that says that the motivation is there if we create the conditions for people to want to be in a valued profession where they're serving their country.
It's absolutely right. There are great examples on every aspect. Teach for America is a great example for creating those incentives. Bringing those things to scale is really the challenge. And that's happened not in every country, but in some of these countries.
So maybe some of our advanced leadership fellows will be taking these innovations to scale. Let me open it up to you, the audience. There are microphones. Time to hear from you, and we have a great panel of a lot of people with a lot of things to say. So, okay, Bob Massey. Identify yourself, but that's Bob Massey.
I used to teach at the Divinity School and got a degree at the Business School, but I have two questions. One is about the cultural question. Perhaps it's a comment, and then you can choose to respond.
And do you have a particular person you're addressing it to?
I think it's probably to President Simmons, but it's a cultural question about the United States right now, and actually the something for nothing. We are in a moment when we seem to be eager to fund public education and other things through things like casino gambling, slot machines. The teachers union here in Massachusetts is supporting this as a mechanism. And I'm not so much concerned about the direct dollar for dollar, but the message that this sends that we are not going to have the honest debate about revenue, but we are going to try to tax, essentially, a particularly vulnerable population to benefit another population in theory. In fact, often it's the same group. So I wonder if we don't have a kind of casino mentality from Wall Street to the legislature that has swept across America that we have to get over before we can do these things. The second thing I wanted to ask is that I just very briefly, while I was listening attentively, looked at my iPhone and discovered that on Google Trends that free online learning is the #1 search term in Malaysia, India, Pakistan, and so forth, and that there are 10.8 million courses, or million hits, if you put in free math course. So I'm wondering, are we spending a little too much time on what I acknowledge is the critical teacher-student relationship, but there are a lot of other learners who aren't children, who aren't necessarily in institutions or schools of various kinds, and are looking perhaps to the new technologies available to learn all through their lives and in ways that perhaps we haven't thought of institutionally in places like this.
So those are both big questions.
Goodness.
So turning to you, but I also then invite other
Incredibly.
panelists.
Incredibly big questions. Let me insert here just a cautionary note. I certainly visit schools in every country that I visit. And I'll tell you what I'm invariably asked by ministers of education, by heads of universities, by business leaders. And it doesn't matter how high performing their students are nationally or how much they value education, they always want to have the answer to the same question. How can we achieve what you have achieved in your educational system? And for them, it's about moving away from rigid parameters in education, making education more a venue for more creative thought and problem solving. And that's what everybody in the rest of the world wants to know. So we are doing something here that is creating that latitude for people to create new things and to innovate in ways that much of the rest of the world envies greatly. And now they're trying to devise curricula in their countries. Korea is a good example China's a good example to try to do that. So there is some hope here. So in regard to culture, I can't say whether or not we are internally, morally inconsistent in the way that we think about the various priorities that we have and judge that. I can only say that if we really treasure our children and we want the best for them, we should do that as a whole community. We have a president who talks about community values, thank goodness, and what we can achieve together. We may have an opportunity at this moment to think about how we can shape a new nation, one that treasures the potential of every single child. And therefore, if you reach that conclusion and you agree to that, you will find ways to make sure that you're not segmenting opportunity. You care just as much about the child in the inner city getting access to a good education as you do about someone who's getting a good education in a charter school. But it takes that degree of caring about all of our children in order to accomplish that. And I don't know what it means to talk about casinos, revenue from casinos doing that. I can't judge that. But I can judge whether or not we do have a way to proselytize, as it were, about the opportunities for all of our children. I think this is a moment where we have the best opportunity to do that, and I hope we take advantage of it.
Well, the values that you're talking about, values of community, are what built universal public K through 12 education in this country in the first place. And so maybe we need to re-engage those values to go to the next level. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Catherine Ellis. I'm a mid-career student here from Australia. And actually my question's very linked to your comments. It really struck me, I didn't know much about the education system in America before I came here, and one of the things I've been really struck by is how much of it is organised at a very local level. And in my country's education system, it's done at a state level. And it seems to me that by putting it at such a local level, you're naturally disadvantaging kids from poorer communities. So I'm wondering, and as a result of that, you then end up with a whole lot of programs like Teach for America, like Summit Year, I can't remember what it's called. No, it's
College Summit?
College Summit, that's the one. That are about actually fixing a system that's not working. So what I'd like to know is, has there been any discussion around reform in terms of taking schooling to a higher level so that disadvantage and between richer and poorer communities actually gets evened out? And
there's been a lot of discussion of that. Okay. But how are we going to build a constituency for that? I mean, I often sit around with my friends who are similar to where I am socioeconomically. None of us live in the inner city. Okay? Many of us moved to suburban communities so that our kids would be safe and we'd have access to high-quality schools. Okay? Some of us study these issues, we work on these issues, we consult on these issues, but when it comes to our own kids, okay, we don't want to put them at risk. And so even in school systems, I do a lot of work with public school systems. In suburban school systems, one of the biggest impediments to progress is the worry that the most advantaged families will undermine any effort to do things for the less advantaged kids. Okay? I've gotten 5 emails in the last 6 months from a parent in a suburban community who's concerned that the district is too concerned with raising all of the children up. And he's actually a strong advocate for gifted and talented, for his own child who's gifted and talented. And I'm not arguing against gifted and talented services. We can have that discussion. But there's really a fear. If you look at the report I just talked about, we talk about the fear of the administrators, superintendents, afraid to do things to lift up the disadvantaged kids for fear that they'll get fired. And I know 2 superintendents who have lost their jobs in suburban communities for being too out front on trying to close the achievement gaps. And so you're talking about taking their whole communities and merging them in and blending them with communities where you have lots of less advantaged folks.
exactly, so that it's not the local community who has the right to sack the superintendent, it's actually decisions
But
made
those
at
same
different
people
levels.
have political power.
But so we have many issues to deal with. We have values issues. We have big structural issues. Is that a microphone up there? Am I? Yes, thank you.
Paul Simons. I'm director of the Pathways to Prosperity project, which is based at the School of Education. And we're focused on young Americans who get to the age of 25 without earning any meaningful post-secondary degree. My question relates to the failures really in our higher education system. You know, we say we're the envy of the world, but the reality is that we now have, I think, the highest college dropout rate among all OECD nations, and about half of American higher education students are actually in community colleges, which might be renamed factories of failure, because less than 20% of those students earn a degree of any kind in 6 years. So my question is, what do we need to do to improve our higher education system to reach all students? And also, for Andrea Schleicher, why are they surpassing us in getting more students to complete post-secondary education?
Go for it, and then I think you were going to comment also.
Yeah. I think, first of all, many countries are now getting more people into post-secondary education. If you look in the last 10 years, you have about 13 countries that have surpassed US college entry and graduation rates. Why do they get more people in and out? Something has to do with, in part it has to do with funding, not necessarily with tuition fees, but I mean, Australia, we just had someone talking about Australia, for example, asks people to pay tuition, but makes funding available to everyone on a risk-free basis. They pay it back contingent on tax income. I think, I'm not sure to what extent, I guess your question was to what extent the student base that comes out of school is a determinant of failure rate in higher education. I'm not sure we have evidence to that. I think there are probably more stronger incentives for people to get in and complete their degrees successfully. But a lot has changed in the last 10 years. We have seen sort of a really changing landscape that higher education, college and community college is now really the standard internationally. You get more than half of the population across OECD countries entering those programs.
Do they finish?
Yeah, get sort of.
I wanted to sort of respond to the issue of that started before about the resources, and people are upset because, you know, someone for the people that are at the bottom and some at the top and so forth. It always amazes me when we have this discussion about not enough resources. And I think, why do we always have enough resources to put thousands, tens of thousands of people in prison? Why do we always have resources to fight wars? Why do we not ever why don't we ever have enough resources to do what we have to do? If you look at an investment in our country, people like yourself, students here at Harvard and universities across the country, what you could bring back to this country in terms of productivity, innovation, and paying taxes, for that you should all be getting your tuition free, quite frankly, because that would be the biggest investment that our country could make, is educating young people like yourselves who are really going to be the leaders and the innovators of this country. So when we look at dropout rates, when we look at why are we having this conversation of who should get the help, the kids that are at risk for dropping out or the kids who are at risk for not achieving their potential? My answer is they should all be getting the help. They should all be getting the assistance that they need because they're all critical to making our country move forward. So I just wanted to sort of come back and say we shouldn't accept that there aren't enough resources. There are enough resources for other things. We need to question that. And I think we need to, and that's part of the culture and the whole makeup of our country is we need to not accept what's been the status quo and imagine that there can be a difference in the way we educate our young people in this country.
Can I say a word about
Yes.
community colleges? Because I think this is a very important point. While it is true that the dropout rate is very high, I have to say I'm a great admirer of community colleges. And what I've long advocated is that places like Harvard and Brown should make it possible for students from community colleges to end their academic baccalaureate career at places like this. And I think we are far too, again, segmented in higher education as we are in the rest of the educational system. Because you see, the way it's supposed to work in this country is that if you have, when you start school, you should have in mind that if you persist and if you do well, you have many opportunities in front of you. One is that you could go on to community college, but that is not the end by any means. If you do well in community college, you can end up at Harvard. That's the way it's supposed to work. But I think we've become so enamored of this elitist mantle that we don't understand what a discouragement it can be to young people that they might not be able to aspire to do that. So why would a student drop out of high school? Because they see nothing beyond it. Why would a student drop out of community college? Because they see nothing beyond it. The one thing you never do, if you see something beyond where you are, you just keep going. So I think we've got to think more about how we can knit together everything that we're doing. Drop the elitist approach to education and think about what we can do to be a holistic system that is different, that's very diverse, but that it tries to accomplish much of the same thing.
So thank you for, all of you, for opening up the discussion to much bigger kinds of visions and solutions, that we don't have to stick with today's institutions if we can imagine some other ways to do it. Yes, sir.
Good evening. My name is Sebastian Pfotenhauer. I'm a technology policy student at MIT. I have a question regarding higher education, which I would probably put between President Simmons and Mr. Schleicher. There are many reform situations in the world, or many countries in the world are currently facing reform situations in their higher education system. There are Europe, there's Asia, there are many countries and in those continents. And it feels to me that many of the countries who are actually looking for a better system because they realize how important investment in human development is, are still trying or are trying to import certain aspects of the American system, the specific aspects of either elitist schools or special types of excellence, and they usually would connect them to some type of external indicators. So my question, after everything that we heard, would be, does it make sense to import parts of the American system to other countries? What would be the parts, the fractional parts that would be worth importing, and can it actually take place in an intelligible manner?
Yes. What would be your favorite
way,
parts
either
of
way.
the American system?
I will say that when I was a student in France during the riots in the 70s, and those riots were all about opening up the system in France and making it less rigid and bringing some of the attributes of the kind of system we have in this country to French education. What is it about? When I talk to people around the world, it's about a truly engaged model of learning where the student is neither the victim nor a passive learner, but truly involved in their education and respected as such, which I think for the most part takes place at places like this, where you have an opportunity to participate, to help shape what you're doing, and as a consequence of that very active process, you're a very differently accomplished person when you leave. And what they notice is what we often forget is education actually is leading to something. What's it leading to? First, it's leading to how you're able to participate as a citizen. It's leading to your being able to innovate. It's leading to your being able to lead a satisfying life. And so on. Education actually enables all those things. And I think the feeling is that while education can be done one way, which is rigid, high performing, making all of the, being very successful at having students complete and so forth, you can still be a miserable human being as a consequence of that, feeling trapped in a rigid paradigm. And so American education tends to open up. Other systems often close. And so that's the way I would describe their effort, is to try to bring some of that to their systems.
I'd love to believe that, by the way, our happiness scores in the United States tend to be much lower than in some other countries. But yes, we do have a lot of creativity.
But doesn't it
Yes.
allow us to really, the issue of critical thinking is part of the university experience. And while we can't transport, I don't think, democracy, the universities and institutions of higher learning, they really, really provide the ingredients of democracy, which the students participate. And in my experience worldwide, that is something that is difficult to put into measurements and outcomes, but it is something that every individual that has come to the United States and experienced the American experience of the university, that is what they treasure. The opportunity to have options, sometimes too many options, sometimes too much fun, but the whole thing, all together, provides the experience of a society that allows you for openness, allows you not only for critical thinking, but allows you to oppose something and to know that you're still safe.
So you have voice, and you have the opportunity to use it in a positive and powerful way. That's in some ways what we think learning ought to be about. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. I'm Patty Nolan. I actually serve on the Cambridge School Committee, so I'm one of those people with a little bit of ability to spend our resources. And not only is the United States high in resources, but we're at the epicenter of resource spending with our individual spending of $24,000 a student. And I'm committed to trying to address a question I know Professor Ferguson has looked at for us, is despite that, we still have this 35-point achievement gap, which is distressing for all of us. A specific question that I'm looking at in my role is what I can do to, perhaps in your thoughts on whether the recent research on summer learning loss could go a long way to addressing many of the issues we have here, that there's research that shows that, taking 10 weeks off in the summer is not good for any kid, and that middle-class families often fill in with programs or they send their kids to camps that have some academic focus, and that if we could put our resources somewhere that could actually have a very powerful impact in a relatively short period of time to address that. I'm curious as to whether you think the summer learning loss is one of the things that should be at the top of the agenda for perhaps a national movement, because I think internationally also the McKinsey educational study that is also pretty powerful talked about the number of hours spent not just during the school day, but throughout the school year.
Ron?
Well, we run a summer program.
Right. Go ahead.
Talk about your summer program.
Yeah.
We are the summer learning program. I think the fact that we have tens of thousands of children that come into our summer programs, and that's because of two things. One, many parents don't feel that students, particularly the highly gifted students, are getting what they need in the regular schools. And secondly, because they do feel that that loss is there. And so I think there's a lot of studies out there now that show that, in fact, the longer you stay out of school during the summer, the more you lose. So if you're out 3 months as opposed to 1 month, you're going to lose a lot of that retention. And teachers complain about the fact that when the students go back in the fall, they have to sort of repeat half of the year before to get the students ready. So we're hoping, in fact, we have the International Center for Summer Learning is based at Hopkins, and we're hoping that that will make a big difference, not just for specialized programs, but that it does become a part of the regular curriculum so that it is implemented in schools. And that again deals with achievement gaps, because parents that are middle class and wealthy do send their children to all these programs every single summer. That's why we have to raise millions of dollars in scholarships to bring poor children to have the same kind of experience. So I think it's going to be a critical component of learning for the students over the summer.
A short answer prescription is we need high quality time on task. Anything that improves either the quality or the time on task is going to contribute to better learning outcomes. There's one study in inner city Baltimore that's comparing white kids who are advantaged and disadvantaged. What they find is that the entire achievement gap between the advantaged and disadvantaged whites by their early teens accumulated during the summer. That they learn the same amount during the school year, exactly, and then the gap opens during the summer. Now when they bring the black kids in, it also opens up some during the school year. So it's any place we can find more time and more quality is some place we should look for improvement.
Okay. Yes, sir. I want to identify yourself to everybody.
Earl Martin Phelan. I was with Bell for 17 years. Now I'm the head of Summer Advantage USA. So my comment is there are either some racial overtones or undertones I at least wanted to call out. So first and foremost, of any immigrant group, those from Africa are the highest achieving academically. So I just wanted to kind of point that out just so we don't. The second thing, undertone or overtone, is the issue of safety. I've worked 17 years in the front lines in Detroit and in Roxbury and Dorchester and what have you. And the notion of safety in suburban communities, the amount of alcohol abuse, the amount of sexual violence in suburban communities is much higher than it is in urban communities. So I would question the notion of urban is unsafe and suburban is safe. My question goes to the woman who just asked that question. I mean, we could put a sharper point on the power of summer learning. There were 2 studies. There's 100 years of evidence, more evidence than any other things that we're doing. Small schools, the Gates movement, there's no evidence behind that. Summer learning, there's 100 years of evidence that says that if our children participate in high-quality summer learning programs, they will gain. Most recently, and you should look him up, at Johns Hopkins, as you had shared, Dr. Carl Alexander says 66% of the achievement gap is a result of summer learning loss. Dr. Beth Miller here in Boston at the Nellie Mae Foundation found that 99% of the achievement gap. So I think the program that you're running is phenomenal. I think as a country, we need to open our eyes and really use summer to help children, all children excel. Thank you. I guess they're both comments.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you very much. And an experienced social entrepreneur in changing the face of educational achievement. Anybody want to add anything to that? I mean, one interesting comment. So summer, there's something else that happens when children are in school, particularly disadvantaged children, and some of you may want to comment on that. One of our attendees for the think tank used to be Deputy Chancellor of the New York Public Schools and said they hardly ever took snow days. And the reason was because the children get fed in school. And if they're at home, they're not going to get fed as nutritiously. They may not get fed at all. And so I wonder how much goes on in even summer programs that have to do with augmenting conditions in children's lives that are difficult for them. So what about those questions of extreme poverty and of the large number of children in urban schools in the United States that are on free lunch programs or reduced fee lunch programs?
I'd like to make one comment. We had a student, we have quite a few students, but we had a student, for example, that said that the most stability he had ever known in his life was when he was at 3 weeks with CTY. I'm thinking if 3 weeks represents the most stability in his life, the family had been homeless, they've been doing all kinds of things. So I think this issue of what issues do the children bring into the campus or into the school. I have many principals now that tell me that they have sets of clothes in the closets because the kids come in and they're not clean or whatever. So I think there's a lot of issues in our society now that impact that. But the hope in all of this, as despite the circumstance these students come from, the gaps do, they do achieve. And when you mentioned, Ron, about the issue that quality is really important, I think that's the critical part. It isn't just more time, it's what are you giving to them. In our program, for example, they come in and take a genetics course or robotics for 3 weeks, and that's all they take. They live, I think the most important thing is that you have children from neighborhoods who are coming in that maybe have never left their, the neighborhood in LA or in Newark or in New York, and they come in for 3 weeks and they're spending time with children from all over the US and all over the world living at a university campus. Our Stanford University site is for 5th and 6th graders. Can you imagine a young 10-year-old kid coming in and living at a university for that time? They tell us that the students themselves tell us it makes a profound difference in their lives. So I think that's when we talk about, I don't want us to get weighed down by the issue of do we have the resources or don't we have the resources. If we make it a priority, we will find those resources because it does make a difference in terms of the quality that we give to the students, and every single student deserves that.
And so you're saying, as others have, it's not just the time, it's the things that are done with the time and the things that are also improving the conditions under which children are living and giving them aspirations.
It also is everybody's commitment and responsibility. I seldom speak about this experience, but I loved it. When the public schools in the District of Columbia went into receivership, they had this precious idea to have a control board, and I was one of the members of the control board that pretty much took over the school. And it was painful to find out that the capital not only had the most amount of children that were poor, but also there was, in my mind, the most amount of corruption that had been going on for years and years. And it was really to everybody's benefit not to change the status quo. And it wasn't just the black children or the bad teachers who happened to be this. It was everyone. It was the lawyers who were taking advantage, the fancy lawyers, the fancy system that were taking advantage. Everyone was doing litigation, the transportation system. So at some point, we reflect, our schools reflect our communities. And if we don't really together, the business community, the parents, the teachers, and everybody else, if we don't commit ourselves to both to improve that it is to a better standard. And I don't think we have to invent a lot of new curricula. No, there's a lot already there. What sometimes, my experience with the public schools, it was the inability to take the risk and to say, we must do this. You can spit in my face, but if you're not, if you are the principal and you have not been in the classroom or in the school for the last 3 weeks, that means you're not a principal. You will not get a paycheck. I mean, at some point, someone has to say no on behalf of the children, and the systems have just allowed that, and I call that corruption. People don't like to hear, and the District of Columbia, and it took months and months of good people like you to come and say, it's racism, yes, but it's a lot more than racism. It's that kind of commitment that we have to our society and our community, which now the public schools doing better.
I'm glad it had a happy ending. Yes, ma'am, our last question.
My name is Camila Chavez Cortez, and I am an artist. And I want to know when we're going to take away the term minority. It sets up a really terrible expectation for children and for anybody that is called that way. In reality, minorities are majorities if you look at the numbers. And on that point, you know, I found that while I was doing a study while at MIT, for 6 months, I actually videotaped the whole a whole classroom, and I got the videotapes. The role of the arts in children learning is so wonderful and it's so great that I don't think people even tap what that means. And the other part is really accepting what diversity is, because if you come from another culture, you learn to make a decision, something that if you just live in one culture, you don't, because you always think you might be number one. And these are very important issues that I find that should be looked at in the educational system today. Another one is the role of self-esteem. How can we address the role of self-esteem? Because we're getting new technologies that are changing completely what the mores and the values of children are as they use this, and how are we going to address those? And those are very important questions, at least for me.
Would anyone like to comment about the arts, about self-esteem?
I think you raise a number of issues, I think all of which have to do with our vision of ourselves as a culture. I mean, where do the arts fit? Where do our children fit? And when I talk about a social movement for excellence with equity, when others on the panel talk about these bigger ideas about quality of life that we're after, I mean, I think we're at a point in our nation where I think we're ready to have that conversation. Who do we want to be? We're going to be a majority non-white nation before the middle of this century. Okay, it's projected that whites will be 46% of the United States population by 2050. Non-white children of color will be the majority among children before that. We're going to be a very different place. We need to figure out who we are, who do we want to be, what do we care about, what do we value. And I think we're ready to have that conversation in lots of places and compare notes. And we're talking about a program for young people now. We think about calling Conspiring for Success. Mm-hmm. Okay, we need to build our conspiracy to change from how we have been to how we want to be. And I think it's kind of exciting to think about that conversation and proceed to try to make it happen.
I hope that those conspirers will fight the war on ignorance, or whatever we call the war to improve what we do. We are coming to an end, and what you said about the community coming together to say, who do we want to be? I think that dialogue in every country in the world is what will bring about a better world. That's partly the dialogue we want to have in advanced leadership. But there were some other very important things said on a panel of such talented people coming from such diverse backgrounds. And one was that the human mind is infinitely flexible and can learn at any age, and that we shouldn't give up on anybody. And so maybe we need a new No Child Left Behind. We call it something a little bit different. And that it's time to think about these issues in a serious way, and that it's up to the whole community. It's not just a question of of those people who have responsibility for schools and education. It's up to everybody. And so I want to thank each of you for being here tonight and all of you for an excellent dialogue. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. You were great. It was a